Welcome, everyone, as we continue week 4 of the MCIC series. The MCIC series is a virtual conference series hosted throughout the month of March. This conference is hosted by the Department of Campus Climate, although we've had a lot of other partnerships to help us get here and those who continue to work with us along the way. I also want to thank our participants who have engaged either in the live sessions or watched recordings throughout this month. Our registrants and participants are above and beyond our expectations. Even last night, we had to extend our contract with Whova, the app that you may all be using, because we've reached over 550 registrants. So really excited about the continued engagement and support. Soon, Caden is going to be sharing our community standards. We do expect folks to read and abide by these standards, not only today, but in all other sessions throughout the MCIC series. I will ask you all at this time to please mute your microphone when you are not speaking throughout the presentation. This helps reduce background noise and is respectful to our presenters today. Closed captioning is provided for all sessions during the MCIC series. At this time, you should be seeing live closed captioning happening at the bottom of your screen in a dark gray box. If you do not see it, this may be under the button, the CC button at the bottom of your screen, or this also may be under the More button, and you can click View Live Transcript. If you cannot see the live transcripts or if you have any other technical questions, please message Caden or myself publicly or privately in the Zoom chat. As a reminder, most of the sessions for the MCIC series will be recorded, and this one is being recorded right now. This is being done to make the sessions accessible to those who cannot attend live and also for those outside of the UW-Platteville institution. The recorded sessions will be available for viewing up to 3 business days after the live session occurs. You can find these on the Campus Climate YouTube channel or on our SharePoint site. If you have questions, comments, or concerns today or at any time throughout the MCIC series, please message us utilizing the Zoom chat. We also have folks monitoring our email now and, of course, throughout regular business hours throughout the month of March as well. So please reach out to us anytime if you have questions about the MCIC series. Also, as we get started today, Caden and myself are also going to be monitoring the chat. There's going to be a few Q&A or discussion times throughout this presentation. So we do encourage folks to utilize the Zoom chat, again, either publicly or privately if you'd like to stay anonymous. And Greg will also direct you throughout when it's appropriate to unmute your mic and also engage verbally in the space as well. So now I would like to introduce Greg Tremelling. His presentation is entitled Military Connected Students, Higher Education and the Challenges That Come with Service. This presentation focuses on military connected students at UW-Platteville, their experiences with higher education, and the challenges that they experience as a result of their military obligation. Our hope is to have a group discussion to discuss this from students' perspectives and to answer questions to help create awareness and understanding. This session is led by Greg Tremelling, coordinator for the Wright Center for Non-Traditional and Veteran Students at UW-Platteville. I'll now turn things over to Greg.
Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing today? If you're doing good, give me a hand wave. All right, good deal. So thank you, Emily. As you mentioned, I'm going to be presenting today on military connected students, higher education, and the challenges that come with service. As you mentioned, my name is Greg Tremelling. I'm the coordinator, notary, and also do the school certifying official work for the branch campuses for the University of Wisconsin-Platteville Baraboo County and Richland. I am a U.S. Army veteran and also an alumni of UW-Platteville. When I was a student here, I was a veteran and military connected student in the National Guard, and was also a non-traditional student. So we had originally planned to hold a military connected roundtable today to discuss the experiences as military connected students see it, along with the challenges and successes that they've seen during their time on campus. Unfortunately, speaking of challenges, some of the students that we had hoped to participate today have been placed on annual training status for 2 weeks and weren't able to participate today. So we'll go through this presentation, try to keep it interactive, talking about some of the primary topics that they've brought to me over the course of the last year specifically, and some of the challenges and successes that students have told me about as well. We'll also provide some time at the end and throughout the presentation for some discussion so that we can better understand this underrepresented population within many universities. So let's start with the numbers. Let's take a look at the population within the university that accounts for less than 1% of students overall and who have among the greatest amount of curricular and professional responsibility. As we look at the numbers, military connected students are students who are currently in the military as active duty, reservists, or in the National Guard. The Wright Center currently processes benefits for approximately 63 military connected students, which comprises just 0.95% of our total student body population of 6,624 students as of the 10-day numbers for spring 2021. So let's set the stage. You've completed your basic training, your occupational training specialty school, and you've been belittled, berated, torn down, and built back up by your drill instructors to be, in general, a stronger person. You've out-processed, and now you're ready to head back into the world and see what school is all about. Has anyone in the room today experienced this at all? You can just tell me by a hand raised. All right. So you've decided to use the benefits that you qualified for by going to the military at a college where you've applied for a program and that you think you'll enjoy, and at a school that you hope will respect your professional and legal responsibility to the military. Many military connected students are fairly traditional in the sense that they only had a gap in schooling long enough to complete their military training. So school, studying, writing assignments, quizzes, and exams are still pretty familiar to them. Of course, there are some military connected students who have been out of school longer because of active duty service time or other factors, but they really fall into categories that we talk about when we talk about veterans or non-traditional students. And that's two different presentations.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
So some folks are wondering if there should be a PowerPoint at this time or not yet.
Oh, it's not shared, huh?
No, sorry.
I appreciate you letting me know.
No problem.
Good deal.
There you go. Perfect.
All right. Let me move things around on my screen. I apologize. I thought I had it shared. So. Okay, so getting back to where I left off, you know, these students, the folks that have been out of school a little bit longer tend to fall in the categories of veterans and non-traditional students. So what makes a military connected student unique is that they have a legal obligation to attend at least one training weekend per month and 2 weeks per year. And they're subject to being activated on federal or state military orders at any time throughout the year, regardless of what's going on in their personal, professional, or school lives at any time. So you get accepted, attend orientation, register for classes, and start the school year at the end of January for spring semester. You get your tuition invoice the first week and realize that your recruiter had told you that you have benefits that you're eligible for, but you have no idea how to access those benefits. And quite frankly, you don't know where to go to get them, or if they happen automatically, or if you have to pursue it. So you ask around at your military unit, but the unit's education officer is very vague and doesn't seem to know which way is up with regard to how you get your benefits working for you. This is one of the challenges that we're going to talk about today. So you get to week 10 and you receive military orders to assist in voting operations that will take you away from your school for 3 weeks. You have no idea if the school has policies about this or if anyone really knows how to handle this. We're going to talk about this as challenge 2 today. So you talk with your instructors and they're all willing to work with you except for maybe one who's just not sure and doesn't really have an idea of how to accommodate you if they do work with you. We'll talk about this a little bit as an extension of challenge 2, and we're going to just number it as number 3. About 1 year later, you're deployed for 400 days and you decide to withdraw midterm due to your ship date being during the term. We'll call this challenge 4. For the sake of time, we'll hold steady at these 4 challenges, though there's a lot of challenges that are beyond these that our students are experiencing every day because of their affiliation with the military. If anybody here has had these experiences or has loved ones that have experienced challenges while going to school, I'd appreciate if you put something in the comments to let me know what that may have been. So.
Hey, Greg, I apologize for interrupting again. Are we supposed to be seeing the setting the stage PowerPoint screen right now? Or is there another one that, I just had a couple folks that are asking about the problems that you're identifying and if that's on a slide.
Okay, somehow I got muted. So the majority of your slides today are going to be photos.
Okay.
Yeah, so setting the stage is kind of a pictorial representation of some of the stages that these students are going through their training, their deployment, out processing and moving into education, receiving orders, and then what happens after the orders or after you return from your deployment. So we've defined 4 of the most basic challenges that military connected service members have told me about over the course of the last year and that they experience on campus. Now let's talk about these challenges, and we'll take some time to talk about the effects these challenges may have on student success as well. Challenge number 1, how do I access my benefits? So most universities have a person or department that is dedicated to working with veterans. In most cases, that person is located within the financial aid office, the cashier's or bursar's office, the registrar's office, or within the diversity office or division. At UW-Platteville, we have one full-time person that is dedicated to working with the veteran and military education benefits, and a second person who works with them at the branch campuses as a small portion of their duties. It's important that students engage with the Veterans Office prior to enrolling in classes to ensure that they receive their respective education benefits as early as they can in the term. For many of those students, they're using them to pay rent, they're using them to pay other bills, and they're using them to pay their tuition. So it's important that this takes place so that we can get them their benefits right away at the beginning of the semester. For the most part, as long as a student meets with us during the semester, though, we can make sure that we get those benefits set up for them whenever they come in. At UW-Platteville, the Wright Center for Non-Traditional and Veteran Students is the one-stop source for all veterans, military-connected students, and dependents using veteran education benefits. When a student makes contact with our office, we'll work through the steps of the process with that student to get them set up for benefits and answer any questions that they might have along the way. This may seem like an easy step. However, early information or lack thereof about how to access benefit typically colors a student's opinion of the process for that student's entire career on campus. Has anybody in the room had any experience with accessing benefits at a college campus at all? So challenge number 2 is short-term mobilizations. These can be a major disruptor to a student's term, and they're really probably the biggest gray area for instructors. Does anybody know what a short-term mobilization is? Feel free to unmute your mic if you have any idea what that might be.
I'm just guessing, but maybe it's something in response to like a natural disaster, other crises, for like the term says, for a short term. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other ideas? Okay, so short-term mobilizations are typically responses to, like Emily said, natural disasters and things of that nature, or other events going on within typically the states. Short-term mobilizations we've seen over the course of the last year tend to be state call-ups for different events. Basically, it's when a student is called up on military orders for a period of approximately 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes maybe a month in general. Over the last year, we've seen many of these where students were called up to help support voting operations, COVID-19 testing sites, to provide security for civil unrest, and to protect public property, or in some cases to help in other parts of the country. We had several that were deployed to Washington, D.C. a couple months ago as well. You tend to see a lot more National Guard troops affected by this than reservists due to their state affiliation and responsibilities. But reservists may be called up as well if the need is for a federal event. From a student point of view, short-term mobilizations are stressful because they're not typically provided a lot of time to get their affairs in order prior to reporting to their unit. This can be stressful, and it can cause a student to have to prioritize several items in a very short time frame. This year, we've seen students have anywhere from 48 hours to 1 or 2 weeks time to prepare. So, those students who were only provided 48 hours to report to their unit are really experiencing a lot of stress because of that. In many cases, students don't have access to internet while they're away, or they might just not have a lot of downtime where they can address the issues once they're reported to their unit. Can anyone give me an idea of some of the responsibilities that students might have to think about and address prior to reporting to their unit?
If they're renting a place or if they're going to college, they have to give notice. Same thing with at a job, they have to give the proper paperwork and able to turn in. That way you can't be released from your duty. Or if you can't be there to pay your rent, you have to give your landlord proper notice and documentation saying that you're not going to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can cause a lot of stress as well, especially if you only have 48 hours before you report and you don't know if you're going to have cell coverage, you don't know if you're going to have internet coverage or anything else. Anybody else have anything to contribute?
Someone shared in the chat pets and family.
That's a big one. Yeah, so, as we look at this, we have a lot of information available online through our website and through our SharePoint site. But the reality is that many of these students don't look for this information until the need arises. This is why we have workshops and why we try to get the word out to students through other students, as well as when we talk to folks on campus. But because of this, this is really when we get that nervous call about, what do I do? Is anybody familiar with the process on campus for how we help students through preparing for a short-term mobilization? Well, the most important piece of this is communication with the instructors. Students need to talk with their instructors about accommodations and the length of your mobilization as soon as you can. If time is limited, the Wright Center does provide some notification services to help students until they can get in better contact with their instructors. And we'll reach out to those instructors to let them know, listen, we've received orders for this student. We know that the student will be participating in a military exercise or event, and you can expect them to reach out to you when they have the ability to do so. We encourage you to work with this student, and we respect your discretion for how this affects their education. So one thing I do want to mention is that President Obama's Principles of Excellence ask that schools and instructors provide reasonable accommodations for students who are called up for short-term deployments, as long as that student is making satisfactory academic progress. This is something that I don't know how widespread the knowledge is of this. And, we've been asked over the course of the last year several times, what are the accommodations that we can provide? And that's something that I've not only had the opportunity to have discussions with instructors about and students, but also to reach out to other instructors to get suggestions with regard to what types of accommodations they might be providing so that others can benefit and possibly use that in their courses as well. Students also have some additional options if they find that they can't keep up after mobilization, such as they're able to withdraw from the term for a full refund. They can withdraw from selected courses with a full refund of any difference in tuition. They can work with an instructor to take an incomplete to allow for additional time after the semester is up so that they can complete their work. And the least preferred option, and one that we try to sway people from using, is that if they've completed enough of their work in the course, that the instructor has the discretion to be able to provide a final grade if that deployment comes in the last 30 days of the semester. Likewise, we receive a lot of questions from instructors about what are reasonable accommodations and how long of an absence is considered a short-term absence. Honestly, reasonable accommodations are accommodations that do not undermine the academic integrity of the student's experience and education in that class, but also allows the student to miss the needed time for their service obligation. In addition, this is something that should be discussed amongst the student and the instructor to make sure that it's something that the student feels that they'll be able to complete, and that the instructor feels still provides that student with the information they need to achieve from that course so that they can build upon that information in future courses. With regard to how long of an absence is considered short-term, that's really up to the student and the instructor to determine, but and that's because every student's a little bit different and every course is a little bit different. In general, after conversations with a few folks on campus, including the registrar, we've talked about 2 to 3 weeks is really kind of what we would consider a reasonable time for a short-term mobilization. Though I've seen instructors allow discretion for up to a month, so students can attend their leadership courses and things of that nature. I just feel that if a student misses too much information, that it's very difficult for them to keep up if they take any more time away than that. So what are students doing while they're at military duty? The video that I've got here to share today actually gives you an idea of what they've been doing the last year, as there's been a lot of call-ups for natural disasters and civil unrest, and for voting, and for COVID-19 testing. So I'm just going to play this video here real quick, and we'll move on from there.
It's hard to believe, but 2020 is nearly in the rearview mirror. It's been an incredible stretch for us, and I know we've asked a lot of our force this year.
While circumstances will continue to evolve, here are the facts as they stand. All 54 states, territories, and the District of Columbia have declared a state of emergency.
National Guard in its response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
The hurricane that came through last night.
Flood events that came in.
Disaster response during floods, hurricanes, and wildfires.
When disaster strikes, we don't have to mobilize from some base. We pack a lunch, we go to work, because we are already there in the communities. We live there. We can respond faster.
and they've been an unbelievable asset, all these other hands processing ballots.
We're so blessed to have this many soldiers come out and help us feed needy families during this difficult time.
Saying thank you to the National Guard to honor all the hardworking men and women day in and day out.
So it's invaluable what your soldiers are doing with the food services and with medical and things of that nature. They're literally saving people's lives every day.
You can see on people's faces the relief that comes when they know they have food to eat for the rest of the day, maybe the rest of the week.
So we're trying to make sure they feel safe coming out here and expressing their opinions and affecting the kind of change they want to see.
Fire knows no boundaries, and so, you know, we train together, we fight fire together.
It's nice to be here and be doing my job.
Just knowing that you're helping out, just knowing you're giving back to the community is pretty good.
Being a part of this mission is honestly very fulfilling. It's what I signed up for. It's what most of the soldiers with me signed up for.
To help out in any way possible and giving 110% to any community that we serve.
And remember this, always ready, always there.
I apologize. When we tested this before we had the presentation, the closed captioning worked on the videos. So hopefully the closed captioning integrated into the presentation caught some of that. So challenge number 3, we talk about accommodations for mandatory military service. I put this in here really to have a conversation because the information or lack thereof is typically what plays into the scenario where an instructor is hesitant to provide accommodation for a short-term mobilization. Any thoughts, questions, or dialogue about short-term mobilizations and how we navigate this as students or staff? Feel free to go ahead and unmute your mic as necessary.
And my experience with short-term mobilizations and leadership courses that you had mentioned, it can really throw a wrench in your education. Luckily, my instructors have done really well to accommodate me, but if they didn't, I probably would be failing some courses right now. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing. That's true. And that's why I chose to kind of go this route with the presentation today, is just to make sure that we have some information out there for both sides so that people know, have some familiarity with the processes and whatnot. Anybody else would like to share? Any instructors that have had experience with this that would like to share their experiences and how they've helped students or some of the challenges that they've encountered while helping students through these situations?
I would say one of the challenges that I've seen is that maybe they're gone for 3 weeks, but if they haven't been able to do any schoolwork while they're gone, which is pretty typical, when they come back, they're now trying to catch up on 3 weeks worth of work for all of their classes. And depending on the point of the semester, that can be very challenging for the students to try and catch up on all of those different courses while still learning the new material that's now being taught. And so it's not just a matter of how long they're gone, it's needing to give that buffer time for them to catch up on everything when they're back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for students who are mobilized during the first part of a term, that becomes even more difficult than those who are mobilized at the end of a term, because those that are mobilized at the end of a term could potentially take an incomplete to finish that information, whereas those at the beginning really just have to catch up so that they can make sure they're grasping the information that they need as they move on through the coursework during that term. Anybody else? All right, we'll go ahead and move along here then. Challenge 4, long-term deployment. As we know, occasionally students are called up for long-term deployments, and sometimes a student's short-term mobilization becomes a long-term deployment, as we've seen this semester. We've already had one student that I just worked with a couple days ago who had their short-term mobilization extended through the end of March, and it started back before the end of 2020. That's made it necessary for that particular student to withdraw from this semester because he just couldn't keep up. So This challenge is kind of multifaceted because sometimes long-term deployments are voluntary and sometimes they're mandatory. Either way, students are placed on orders and they face similar stressors in these situations and need information to help them navigate and respond to that deployment. I mentioned in the previous slide that these students have 4 options available to them when they're deployed. They can withdraw from the term for a full refund, withdraw from selected courses for a full refund of any difference in tuition, work with an instructor to take an incomplete to allow for additional time. And like I mentioned before, if they're within that last 30 days and an instructor feels that they have covered the coursework that's necessary for that course, final grades may be issued. But I know that myself, and I've discussed this with the registrar, we really try to make sure that a student can complete the coursework rather than have that happen. So, in addition, students who step away from their schooling in response to a deployment have different options for returning to school after deployment as well. Students who are returning from military service who have interrupted their studies to enlist and attend military training or deployment may return without applying for readmission if the period of absence doesn't exceed 2 years. To do this, a student simply needs to provide the Wright Center with a copy of any set of orders covering the period of absence, and we'll work with the registrar's office to get them set back up to come back to school without reapplying. So it is a fairly easy process and doesn't take more than a couple days in most cases. Does anybody have any questions or discussion regarding long-term deployments or experiences that you've had as a soldier or airman or Marine dealing with this, or as an instructor dealing with folks coming back from long-term deployments? All right, we'll move along then. So what are the effects and challenges that our students are experiencing? Would anybody like to share any thoughts about this?
I had one of my advisees that was returning after, I think this was not a deployment, but they were doing training. And they were like on base trying to register for classes with limited access to computer and limited access to internet. So just the technical challenges are even there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, talking about the limited access to internet and computers and things of that nature, you look at folks who are deployed to Washington, D.C., for example, and you would think Washington, D.C., big city, almost every building probably has internet. My experience with that was that students did not have access or time to find internet connections while they were there. So while some students were provided accommodations and thought that they might be able to work on assignments and things of that nature while they were in Washington, D.C., they found out as they were there that they just weren't able to because they didn't have that connectivity. So any other experiences, anybody? All right, so much of what we've discussed today really comes down to communication. As we've found, students wait until they need information before they look it up, and in many cases may not have time to put the information to work for them. In addition, some instructors have been hesitant to provide accommodations where warranted, and students sometimes feel that they don't have much recourse when this happens. Again, it really comes down to communication, not only between the student and instructor, but also from our lens as far as getting that information out to the instructors to help them understand some of the requests and responsibilities we have with regard to veterans and military connected students and the GI Bill requirements that in many cases require us to work with students as well. So I think what a lot of students probably experience, and this has been just from talking with students over the course of the last year, is that they really get a kind of a sense of anxiety. I've met with students who didn't feel supported, and I've met with students who felt very supported. And a lot of this comes down to they didn't have, or they didn't reach out for, or couldn't find the information they needed to navigate the situation, or because they felt the treatment they received wasn't considerate of their unique circumstance. And in some situations, all it took was just, a conversation while they were deployed from the Wright Center to the instructor, and just back and forth, just to talk about what the student was experiencing. So when this happens, this can affect their drive, their motivation, and it can show in their grades. Many students, when given the opportunity, at least our military students, will not disappoint us, and they'll excel with what we ask of them. And I've found a lot of students who say, the accommodation I was provided was very difficult, but I took that as a challenge and I used it to succeed in that class. So I really have to give credit to the instructors on campus, because they do a great job of helping these students succeed in light of their military obligations. So another impact that this can have is that if students don't feel supported, they may not return after the mobilization or deployment, which really affects our retention levels and looks terrible considering how little it takes to impact retention percentages of such a tiny population. So by and large, we know that student veterans, military students, and non-traditional students may come and go during their college careers. But as with any population, we really want to see them stay in school and stay engaged and graduate earlier than they would otherwise. So I think the big thing to remember is that we are all in this together. Where we fail to ask questions and where we fail to communicate, it really affects both students and faculty. Our goal of this today is to not only help clear up some of the questions that are out there about challenges of this population, but to also encourage everyone who's participating to reach out to the Wright Center if you have questions about how you can help a military connected student, a veteran, dependent of a veteran, or a non-traditional student. With as many resources as we have on campus, I think that sometimes areas may get overlooked, and I hope that today's presentation has helped create some awareness, as well as provide some opportunity to address questions you may have had as a member of this population, or as an instructor or staff member supporting this population. So now is an opportunity for us to kind of kick back and take a look at the information we've heard here today, and to have a discussion about that, or any other topic regarding military connected students. So I'd open up the floor, and go ahead and unmute yourself if you have any questions, concerns, burning questions, things of that nature.
I can see where this would be specifically challenging for students that are planners, because I have a lot of students that'll even, as a freshman, plan out all 4 years, and then all of a sudden you're thrown a wrench by, oh, you have to go to this long-term deployment. How do you handle that, and how does that affect you emotionally when you are a planner and need to know how things are happening and when they're happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that tends to be the most common students that come in to see me. I do have one student who is gone typically at least twice per semester because of one of the organizations within the National Guard that student is a member of. So at the beginning, it was very difficult to navigate that, because as we all know, you miss a lot of information when you're gone multiple times throughout a semester. So that student really made a commitment to each of their instructors, and does every semester newly make that commitment to let their instructors know that, hey, I'm going to make this information up, and if I can't, I have absolutely no problem, withdrawing from the course if I need to, but I want to try and make this happen because it's important that I get through school. So any other questions, concerns? thoughts, experiences?
Hi, Greg. I just had a question. Do all military students on our campus, do they make a connection with your office, or is that a requirement if they're coming here that they reach out to your office, or does that just voluntary?
Yeah, so that's completely voluntary. I appreciate your question. Typically, the students that are making contact with us the most are the ones that are also using veteran or military education benefits. We do provide a workshop each semester that talks about benefits for students, how they use them, how they sign up for them, what their responsibilities are to those benefits, and what those benefits then provide them. So that particular program is new as of spring of 2020, and we've had some good response to that workshop. But we do notice that if a student isn't aware of veterans education benefits, military education benefits, et cetera, they may not reach out to us because they don't truly understand, or maybe even they aren't aware of our area and the services and information we can provide. So
well, recognizing that, Greg, now that it's voluntary, if as an instructor, if an instructor has a student that they're working with on a short-term mobilization and they think they have a good plan, is there still a benefit to requesting or asking to make sure they're aware of your office, or maybe even reaching out just for both the instructor and the student, just to make sure things are being done appropriately, or to see if there's other ideas or resources that might be helpful with the process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as much as we can help each other make students aware of the resources that exist, the better off we'll be. And we certainly appreciate that, knowing that while we do send information out pretty much every semester, not everybody on campus is getting that information every time. So it's important that if they're not aware, they at least have the opportunity by having that information. So
thank you.
Greg, I have a quick question.
Go for it.
I just want to say thank you so much for hosting this and extending this session to external institutions. And so I'm here with my class from Southwest Tech, and we're very thankful to be here. I just want to share that I've worked with students at UW-Platteville, particularly this year, who do serve in different capacities. And I know that there's been a lot of internalized tension in their identity development, in that many times some of the students that I work with who come from low income backgrounds sign up for service not for the noble's sake, but for the sake of addressing financial gaps, right, in terms of access for education. And so my question for you is, how do you envision supporting students through some of that internalized tension around, serving and balancing and trying to address their financial gaps, in addition to being great students? Like, what does that need to look like through the context of the world that we're navigating?
Yeah. First of all, it's great to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. So that really gets kind of tricky in some situations. And I think you alluded to that in your question. Students need to explore their own individuality, and they need to find their way of expressing that on campus and within their social circles. I think it's important that, and this is kind of where the workshop that we created last spring came from, was offering that opportunity for students to explore the benefits that they are earning outside of a environment that is, kind of throwing the patriotism down their throat. We want to make sure that we're inclusive of all of the students that we're serving. That really is one of the benefits of also being the non-traditional student center on campus, is that we try to make things as inclusive as possible. So, we have a very small space up here in our lounge, and we try to make sure that any student that comes up here is comfortable, whether they be a dependent, whether they be a veteran, whether they be in the military, a non-traditional student, or somebody who is in the military using benefits, but doesn't necessarily want to identify as a person from the military. So we treat military folks as though they're a protected identity. If they don't want other folks to know that they are in the military, we don't tell other folks that they're in the military. And likewise, we want to make sure that they have access to the funds that they need and the resources that they need, so that they can be successful in college with as little stress related to that as possible. And we try to make sure that if they're not aware of specific benefits, such as a reservist who may not be aware of military tuition assistance, we want to make sure that they learn about that and that they can ask their education office within their unit, how do I access this? I was told about this by my school, how do I get it? Or if a student isn't aware of the Wisconsin GI Bill, that they have the ability to access that. And we want to make sure that we're providing access for all students, regardless of their feelings about their service or about the institution that they are serving, really to gain that ability to come to school. So does that kind of answer your question, Jeremy?
Yeah, that's within line. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely.
Greg, I had 2 questions come in.
Yeah.
So the first question is, could you maybe speak more specifically to the challenges that people of color or LGBTQ people or women face in the military?
Mm-hmm. And this is one of the questions that I really want to add to my supporting student veterans and Pioneer VetNet Ally presentations. But I think that this is a question that is ever evolving. And I know, Emily, you and I started discussing it a long time ago and it kind of fell off because of other responsibilities. But this can change every 4 years if we have a change in administration, unfortunately. Policies for the military tend to be created and enforced by whoever the president is. And it can change how these folks are treated and how they experience life in the military. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in the military. I think with regard to how folks experience life within these populations. And while it's come a long ways since like the 1950s, 1970s, 1980s, I still believe that they are light years behind the rest of society. So, and certainly there are a lot of conversations to be had with regard to why that is. But I do acknowledge that it's difficult for folks that may identify other than, the recognized, white male person going into the military to be successful in the military. I am heartened by the fact that I see a lot of leadership in the military who are identifying as other populations or micro populations within the military. So that is something that I'm excited to see, and I think that there's a lot to be offered by those folks, and I hope that it continues to grow with regard to the people getting the opportunities that are out there. So does that answer that question, Emily? At least for now. I know it changes, and I think I want to do some exploration into that so that we can add that piece into our other trainings. But
Yeah, thank you. The other question I had is if you are an advisor or peer or faculty to someone who is in the military and you're concerned about them either like academically or emotionally, where should you go in order to help the student? should you be going to the Wright Center first, Dean of Students? What are kind of the chain or steps of resources if you are concerned about a student's well-being?
Yeah, as far as academically is concerned, there may be resources that we can provide to students depending on benefits that they may be using. In terms of getting them assistance through tutors and things of that nature. Some of the veterans education benefits that some students are using do provide extra money for tutelage if the need arises. So certainly that's something that we can help students explore. And likewise, we can help them find the other resources on campus that may be of benefit to them as well. I think that as we look at the academic resources for these students, we're going to try and do what it takes to help them be successful. From an emotional standpoint, always, if you have concerns about a student and they've come to you and confided in you, I don't ask that you contact the Wright Center first unless that student is not in imminent danger. If they seem to be somebody who needs that help immediately, certainly contact counseling services or the appropriate authorities to make sure that they get the help they need. If it's somebody who's coming to you and says, hey, I'm just having a hard time and I'd like to talk to somebody. I do have military experience. I am a veteran. I served overseas. There's a possibility that they may also have some benefits that will allow them to speak with VA mental health as well. So in addition to setting them up with counseling services to speak, maybe it's beneficial to contact us as well, and we can help them navigate that red tape to help them access the mental health through the VA. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And then one more thing, this is from me for the good of the group. Could you remind us all of the different branches within the military?
This is my favorite question. So you've got the
Okay.
Army, which is the oldest. You've got the Marines, which is not the second oldest, but in the hierarchy of the military comes second. Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and most recently added the Space Force. So that is the 4+1 or 5+1 branches of the military. So questions, thoughts, concerns?
Greg, I actually have a quick question for you.
Yeah,
so does the UW-Platteville or UW system as a whole have a military relief fund that can assist military students facing hardships relating to school or military duty or things to do with being a veteran?
This is an individual answer by institution at this time that I'm aware of. I do know that there is one school that has a relief fund for, and interestingly, it's the only other school that combines non-traditional and veteran students for non-traditional and veteran students. So I have explored it a little bit. To this point, we have really relied on the Pioneers Helping Pioneers program as a great program to help folks get the help that they need. But certainly I recognize and have had conversations about the potential of putting together a relief program for veterans and military connected students. So I think that that's still a good conversation for the future as we see what the need is and kind of move forward. Does that answer your question, Brett?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Any others out there at all?
Greg, you had a question in the chat. Are you currently providing programming for students virtually?
Yes, Soraya, and I will be getting back to you. I am not ignoring you, but I do have had some other things prioritized above that. So yes, and I will send you an email in the next day to get that information to you. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. All right, I'll turn it back over to Emily and Caden. Thanks, Emily.
All right, thank you so much, Greg. And I just want to thank folks for participating today. We know that folks have other engagements this afternoon, so feel free to head out as needed. I know that we'll stay a few minutes if there are any lingering questions, if folks feel more comfortable asking in a smaller setting. So we'll hang out here for a little bit, but thank you again for joining, and thank you, Greg, for your presentation.